All right, so first off, wanted to, as always, thank Jonah for running the AV. Wanted to thank Belinda and the Office for Student Life for hosting this. They've got the vouchers. Make sure you guys sign in at the back table to make sure that you get record for being here. And Pathology Club, not surprisingly, will be hosting tonight since we are talking essentially about the entire history of what is disease. How do people conceptualize it, and how do they actually try to categorize it throughout history? All right, so we'll get started. So last time we really kind of left off moving from ancient history up to the Renaissance with more or less chronological kind of a flow. What we're going to do from here on out is take one topic and try to follow it from roughly that era onward, and then jump back. And this session we're talking about disease. Next session will be about treatment. Session after that will be surgery, and just describing how those things developed from that fundamental basis of having humoral imbalance as basically the concept that people had for what made someone healthy or diseased. So people were pretty much in agreement that a balance of your four humors, black bile, yellow bile, air, and blood, were responsible for your being healthy, or if they were out of whack, for being unhealthy. But how those four humors were going to be affected by different things really wasn't something people had done a great deal of thought about. So investigators in the ancient Greek world, Roman world, and in the Islamic empires of the Middle Ages began classifying diseases and theorizing about how they spread, and they came up with a lot of different ideas. So there's miasma, bad air is going to cause disease. Contagion, this rough idea that, well, disease does seem to spread from one person to the next. Spiritual judgment, that's been around and remains around. Maybe you did something, got a demon in you, did something that displeased God, and therefore you're ill. Humoral imbalance, again, not necessarily known why, but that going to be a cause of disease. Bad diet, not everything was wrong. We get that one too. Bad diet can affect your health for sure. And last time we left off with the discovery of more or less accurate human anatomy based on dissection done by Andreas Vesalius. So he had really kind of typified what anatomy was so that surgeons and other researchers could have that fundamental basis going forward. But it's thought that he actually did quite a bit of work on unhealthy organs and the appearance of pathologic tissues as well. However, he was so upset that his colleagues were really attacking him for defying the authority of Galen that he basically burned all of his papers and left to become the physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. So kind of a nice desk flip moment there. Wish we had those papers, but he decided to not leave them for anyone. So when we come up with concepts of disease, one of the most interesting things I think is that shortly after that, a guy named Girolamo Fracastoro theorized that there were contagious seeds that could be spread from person to person. Now obviously, microscopic life was something that people had no concept about at this time, but the idea that disease spread through discrete particles was something that he came up with, and sadly, that thread of investigation was lost. However, he is also known for having been the first person to name and describe accurately the progression of syphilis, and if any of you want to take up this challenge, go right ahead. He didn't publish it in a journal, he described it in a poem about a shepherd named Syphilis, who was cursed by Apollo, and then he described the progression of the disease and its appearance thereafter. So if you want to describe your medical discoveries in the concept, in a play or a poem, go right ahead. It's not challenging enough to get a journal article, apparently. Another person named Jean Fresnel did a lot of work in terms of categorizing disease, and basically came down to an idea that you could generalize it in terms of how it manifested in the body. Was it a general disease like fever, something that could be affected over a lot of the body, or a localized disease like a tumor somewhere, an injury? So special and general types of disease were roughly how he categorized things. His actual method was way more difficult than that. It also involved which part of the body, was it above the waist, below the waist? But he was trying to actually come up with some idea about how to actually categorize disease, because separating them from each other is not as straightforward as people might think. Now the dissection had really kicked off. We're starting to get pathological dissection, but because dissection was only done on executed criminals, or very rarely in the case of a forensic dissection to establish a cause of death in someone who may have died mysteriously, generally people who were dissected were not elderly or diseased. They were people who were young and healthy and had committed some crime. And in fact, one of the early pathologists had the exact opposite complaint that we often have in the anatomy labs today, is that they're looking at too many healthy people with no signs of disease. Whereas these days, we have people who have multiple disease states that we're able to investigate in the lab, but that might also mean that some of their organs and muscles are very badly atrophied due to the state of disease they were in close to the end. Now, what Severino did was kind of interesting, is he investigated a specific area of pathology, namely swellings. And his book was basically looking at how swellings occurred, so things that would cause edema, tumors that would manifest in different parts of the body. Because they didn't really have a concept of the tissues going bad, he thought that there was a probable single cause for swellings in different parts of the body, apart from the tissues that were there. Now, another guy named Franciscus Sylvius, and this is just a parade of names right now. We'll get back to concepts in a minute, but the parade of names continues because this guy basically took up the mantle of Harvey. You might remember that William Harvey described how the blood circulates, because the prevalent theory by Galen was that the blood was created by the liver, just washed out to the organs as they needed it, and there was no method for returning it, meaning that that blood would have to be created, de novo every single day. Sylvius was a big proponent of that, but he also looked into physiologic chemistry and started looking at the biologic processes of the body as akin to physiologic reactions and chemical reactions. So he said that there were acidic and alkaline elements that were normally in balance in the blood, and if these were disturbed, the body would become unhealthy. And I know we're barely into respiratory for the first years, but have you guys talked about acidosis and alkalosis yet? Second years? Yay? So yeah, he was right. So basically, acidosis and alkalosis of the blood and other tissues can be a sign, or rather a cause, of disease and a sign of some underlying pathology. Now, the one problem that we had with Harvey is that no one described or was able to verify that there were actual connections between the arteries and the veins. But that changed when we had the microscope come along. And there were early microscopists like Robert Hooke and other people throughout the European continent. But the one who actually first really described the fact that there were capillaries was Italian, Marcello Malpighi. And this is actually the illustration he made of some frog lungs actually showing the microscopic connections between the arteries and the veins. So basically, really nailing home that idea that Galen was wrong about the way blood operated, and that we have a now accurate concept of blood moving through the arteries, to the tissues, back to the heart through the veins. So, for anybody, who actually is in the pathology club here? Got a couple, there we go. Well, this one's for you. So, pathology club, you guys get to claim the best names for old Renaissance era books. So the first compendium of pathology that was assembled was by the great title, Sepulchridum Sive Anatomica Practica ex Cadaveribus Morbo Dentatis. So enjoy that. And it's basically a huge compendium of pathologic findings that were discovered at autopsy. Now, this compendium could have been and should have been a major step forward. The problem was the author, Bonnet, did not actually organize it. So it was just basically a bunch of case studies in no particular order, and so they weren't really that useful. However, a good idea is a good idea, and here's yet another great name. Ready? Giovanni Battista Morgagni, that's the name of the person, was a physician who started doing pathological autopsies at the hospital where he worked, and he was able to follow the person from their admission, the course of their disease, and if they died, to the autopsy table to actually see where the disease manifested. So he had a very long look at their clinical history leading up to the pathology. And he, basically took 50 years of clinical practice and consolidated it into his book, and here's the name, De Sedibus et Causibus Morbororum and Per Anatomica Indicare. So essentially, the seats and causes of disease. And he did the smart thing, he included an index. And unlike a lot of these discoveries which were ignored or kind of poo-pooed at the time, this one was an immediate sensation with any doctor who could get a hold of it, because they could get this book, look up in the index, ooh, I got a patient with a fever, flip through all the cases that had fever and see if they could actually find something that would correlate to that and get some idea about how the disease might be progressing, what fit their patient, what did not, and how they might actually be able to intercede to help them out before they passed away. So this was really the first what we call nail in the coffin of humoral theory of disease. Because, Morgagni didn't find diseased black bile. He didn't find too much air in some part of someone's body. He found organs. And he actually said that the symptoms that someone experienced during a disease were the cries of the organs that were suffering, and basically moved from the idea that you had this whole body circuitry of humors to basically saying like, no, we have organs, and the disease of these organs is what causes our problems. And this really is where pathology as a discrete topic really took off. Now, we've been kind of, like I said, going through the parade of names up until now, but big historical events do have a big impact on the history of medicine, and one of them was the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution had a lot of negative consequences for people, including Antoine Lavoisier, the chemist, was actually decapitated during the Reign of Terror, and a lot of other prominent people in high positions of power were knocked down. Now, that generally worked out negatively, but in the case of French science and medicine, it did something interesting. It took those very regimented, authoritative people out of power, and suddenly the younger, more innovative people had a chance to do their work. So French science actually took a big leap forward in the years after the Revolution, once the Reign of Terror calmed down, because you had people not having to fight for acceptance of novel theories. So amongst the French pathologists who were active at that time, they took Morgagni's idea that the organs were diseased and were able to microscopically take it a bit further, and finding out that tissues, not even entire organs, but sometimes just the tissues of the organs, can be the cause of disease. Now, I never took French in high school, so bear with me. It's Marie-Françoise Xavier Bichat and Jean Cuvier. They brought microscopic pathology and anatomy into France and basically had a nice and color atlas of pathologic disease. And if you look at the right there, anybody want to take a stab at what condition is being indicated there? It's the lining of the heart. Good. Inflammation of the pericardium is pericarditis. Yeah, so we're actually seeing diseases manifested and kind of demonstrated that match up with the way we think of things today. So we're moving from the entire body being diseased to organs being diseased, now to individual tissues that contribute to the organs being diseased. Now, jumping way to a different topic, we've got the miasma theory of disease still prevalent, and basically saying, well, it's bad air. When you have bad air, you basically have the people in that area destined to get sick, and there's not much you can do about it other than move away. There's not a whole lot you can do to fight that miasma. The person who really put that to rest was John Snow. Okay. That John Snow, sorry. This John Snow knows nothing, and this one knows some good stuff. I'll be very sad when that reference never lands anymore, so thank you for laughing. All right, so John Snow, Dr. John Snow, basically was a physician who was present when there was a massive cholera outbreak in London. And he did the first basically modern investigation of epidemiology, and he looked at where the people were who were getting sick. And really there was no single thing other than a single well where they drew their water that seemed to be the real kind of location that was causing the cholera outbreak. And the real thing that struck him was that there were people who lived far away who would draw water from that well because it had a reputation for having really clear, good water, who would get sick and were nowhere near the same miasma that might be affecting the people on Broad Street where that pump was actually located. So he basically was able to convince people who doubted him that he was right. In fact, there was a reverend in that area who was convinced that John Snow was wrong, but after talking with him, he completely flipped and came around to John Snow's side and said that the pump was the problem. So they removed the pump handle, and essentially the cholera outbreak that was going on had subsided, but they were pretty sure they stopped another one from happening because when they dug the well up, they found that the cesspool from some houses, and by the way, back before modern plumbing, where did all the poop go? It went into a room under your house, and it just kind of stayed there until you hired people to come shovel it away and take it to the country. Well, this cesspool had eroded the walls of the well, so you basically just had No food tonight, good. You basically had fecal matter leaking into the well from which people were pumping the water. You get cholera into that, and basically you've got this great mechanism to spread the disease. So this was really one of the first times people had linked the real spread of disease rather than just kind of rough ideas of, oh, it's contagious, or oh, there's bad air in that area. And they actually had a real mechanism to follow thereafter. Now, I mentioned how the French Revolution knocked down some of those entrenched power structures that held innovation back. This is really evident in Vienna, where those power structures stayed intact. So Vienna had this really modern, brand new hospital built called the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, and it saw a huge number of patients, 14,000 or so annually. And it was divided into 2 wards in terms of obstetrics. One ward had the women seen by midwives, and the other ward had the women seen by physicians. Now, the hospital really was ahead of its time in a lot of ways because it had mandatory pathological examination of all the patients who died there. So it really was trying to research how disease happens and make new discoveries. But as we'll see, that mechanism actually led to some tragic consequences. Before we go into that story, though, I just want to draw the name of the doctor here who was responsible for the Krankenhaus. His name's Karl Rokitansky, and you may hear some things named after him. There's some sinuses inside diseased gallbladders that bear his name. But the thing that I love the most that bears his name is Mad Max. Mad Max properly is Mad Max Rokitansky, and he was named after Karl Rokitansky because the director of the Mad Max movies is a medical doctor, and he financed the first movie by doing extra shifts at the ER. And if you watch the Mad Max movies, there's little medical nuggets sprinkled in there. Ooh, pneumothorax. Ooh, blown pupil. So, there's stuff like that scattered throughout there. So, by all means, go watch Mad Max and convince yourself that you're studying. Now, back to where these power structures really kind of sabotaged the progress of medicine. I mentioned how the midwives would see one group of women, and the doctors would see another group of women who were coming into the obstetrics units. The mortality rate in the midwife unit was around 3%, but in the unit seen by the doctors, it was over 20%. And basically, what did we default to? It must be some bad air. Yeah, the one that the doctors are in, that's on the side facing the river. The miasma comes in, that's what's causing the disease. And the women were dying of what was known as childbed or puerperal fever. It's basically a bacterial infection of the reproductive tract, and someone goes septic, and that kills them. Well, a Hungarian named Ignaz Semmelweis was working there as an obstetrician, and he basically thought to himself, that doesn't make any sense. There's no way that the bad air is causing that really marked discrepancy. But what he noted was that the hospital, which had a policy of having people do the dissections and autopsies of their patients, the medical students would come in first thing in the morning, go to the dissecting room, do the autopsies, and this is way before gloves were a thing. They would do the autopsies barehanded, walk upstairs, and then go down the line, bed to bed, of their patients doing pelvic exams. You couldn't come up with a better way to spread disease than that they actually came up with accidentally here. So Semmelweis decided that, well, what we ought to do is actually have people, wash their hands in between. Crazy it may seem, these guys weren't even washing their hands, let alone taking off their clothing that was, befouled and so forth. So he got into a position where he could actually make people wash their hands in between. His colleagues all hated it because it slowed things down, and the chloride solution that he had them wash in was kind of irritating. But guess what happened to the mortality rate? Dropped down to 3%, basically the same level as the midwives wing. So you'd think everything should be great. Here's the problem. Vienna had those entrenched power structures. He was kind of fighting against the way things had always been done. And it didn't help that he had kind of an inferiority complex, and he was really a poor communicator. He would kind of try to put his case forward and then lose patience and just yell at people. So he was not really good at getting the message across. And it doesn't help that he basically insulted all of his superiors and other colleagues, telling them that they were murdering their patients. Now, point of fact, in a way they were, but no one wants to hear that when that's the opposite of your intent. So he was basically drummed out of there. The washing station disappeared, and boom, mortality rates went right back up to where they were. And it wasn't until some of his colleagues aged up to the point where they were in charge that they could actually put those safeguards back in place, because they realized that it worked. Even though Semmelweis was a poor communicator, they realized that it worked, and eventually hand washing became normal. But it took a way longer time than it should have, just because of that lack of ability to communicate and that lack of ability to accept that maybe you need to change the way you're doing things. Semmelweis actually wound kind of a real tragic character. He wound up getting dementia, and the old story is that he was confined to an asylum, and he cut his finger and died of blood sepsis, which is basically what he had been trying to prevent. The real story is even worse. He had dementia and was sent to an asylum. Asylums were not even remotely places of healing back in the day, and because he was demented and he was unable to control himself, he kind of got in fights, and the orderlies beat him to death, which caused the blood poisoning that actually killed him. So they've done some autopsy on his remains and found that there was a lot of trauma just about perimortem. So yeah, very tragic story for Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, in Vienna, there were quite a few other scientific discoveries going on. We've moved from France to Vienna as the seat where a lot of this really good work is being done, and we're going to start seeing some names that actually are going to be familiar to you. The one that you may not be as familiar with is Johannes Müller. He trained, he trained lots of people, but he trained 4 of the all-stars of this era. Now, he was the person who came up with the idea, the accurate idea, that benign and malignant tumor cells were actually related to each other. The prevalent theory was basically that malignant tumor cells were something new, something that had arisen in the body or had invaded the body. And he was able to describe how tumor cells were aberrations of existing cell lines in the body. So pretty good discovery for us to work from. Amongst the people he trained, we have Schwann. Does that ring a bell? Okay, so Schwann cells, we've heard of those. He was the person who came up with the idea that, wow, these cells are all over the place. Maybe everything that is inside an animal is made of cells. And that's basically what it took for us to come up with this cellular idea of life, that we're actually all made of cells. He got this idea from a friend named Schleiden, who had basically made the exact same observation in plants and passed that on to Schwann. Now, next up, we've got Joseph Henle. Now, Henle, you guys can either thank for this or hate for this. He created our normal histologic terminology. So when we talk about stratified, squamous, pseudostratified, columnar, cuboidal, that's when you're talking Henle's language. So he's the person who came up with these categorizations for tissues. And last, and absolutely not least, we've got Rudolf Virchow. Who's heard the name Virchow before? Okay, well, get ready to hear it a lot in the next few years. So where do we even start with Virchow? So, you're all very smart people. You all worked very hard to get here, right? Don't be modest, right? You worked hard to get here. Okay, get ready to feel completely insignificant, and I include myself in that designation. So let's go through Rudolf Virchow's quick biography. 22, he started studying under Mueller, and at 23, became an assistant prosector at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. So we're working in Berlin now. And at age 24, he identified and accurately described leukemia for the first time, coming up with an idea that, wow, these people who are fatigued have this aberration in their blood, and it's due to too many white blood cells. Then he graduated from medical school. So he did so much research that he actually had to found a journal by himself simply to contain all the papers he was publishing about various diseases, microscopic studies, and so forth. And that journal still exists. It's called, I forget the proper name, but it's called Virchow's Archive, is what most people refer to it as loosely. He was actually tasked with figuring out why there was a typhus outbreak in an area, and basically the idea was, well, okay, it's bad air, bad water, these people are poor people have bad hygiene, there's not much we can do about it. He said, no, that's not it. It's because there's no infrastructure there. They have terrible sewage, they have terrible water supply. So he was basically looking at how the infrastructure impacted disease. That actually made him a lot of enemies, and trying to say that they had to fix that infrastructure and it wasn't good enough, got him expelled from Berlin, and he wound up becoming a professor in Würzburg. Now, where that's kind of basically where Semmelweis fell off the face of the earth, Virchow never stopped. He kept on pushing and pushing and publishing and became the major voice in Austrian and German pathology and medicine, and basically was able to return to Berlin as the chair and basically being in charge of all pathology at that hospital. Now, that's impressive. Lots of stuff is named after Virchow. However, he's just as well known and probably actually more published in anthropology than he is in medicine. He did more anthropological studies than he did others. And my favorite story about that is, this is way before the Nazis, but it was not way before anti-Semitism had very deep roots in German and Austrian politics. And he was really fed up with the anti-Semitic parties that were kind of propagating various lines. And so he did a study of German school children and found that very few, quote unquote, true Germans had blonde hair and blue eyes, and even more damningly, 14% of Jewish school children had blonde hair and blue eyes. And basically was saying that any of the anti-Semitic pseudoscientific claims were garbage. And when Hitler came to power, he always took every opportunity to talk about how terrible Virchow was and how bad Virchow was. So if you're on Hitler's shit list, you've done a good thing with your life. My kid's there. Hi, Dash. Bad word. I know. Okay. Now, I mentioned already that he's got a lot of public health credentials. He took Berlin's sewers when he was elected to the governing body in the city and took them from being some of the worst in Europe to being the best in Europe, knowing that public health is what would actually help save lives in the long haul versus treating disease once it had already arisen. And again, he was in politics. He made a lot of enemies, including, oh gosh, what's his name? When you go blank in front of a crowd, Otto von Bismarck. He made a enemy of Bismarck, and Bismarck actually challenged him to a duel. And Virchow, being a doctor, said, okay, well, we'll duel, but either it has to be with scalpels, or I'm going to inject typhus in one sausage and not the other, and you and I can pick which sausage to eat, and that'll be our duel. So, he didn't get taken up on that offer. But he did get challenged to the duel. And in case you didn't feel insignificant enough, he was present when they discovered that Troy was an actual place, not just a fairy tale from Homer. So, there you go. So, who feels small? Yeah, me too. However, one person did this, so the bar's been set and it's pretty high, but I think you guys could all reach that bar or exceed it if you really want to. Good luck. Let's talk about other names that are going to be familiar and also doing a lot of good stuff. Louis Pasteur was not a physician. He was a chemist, but he made one of the most important medical advancements in history because he basically destroyed the theory of spontaneous generation in favor of the germ theory of disease. Now, spontaneous generation was the idea that purulent things, whether they be microscopic or large, like mice, flies, other vermin, that they came from things like rotting meat, that they just spontaneously generated from that. And Pasteur was basically able to show that that was not the case. If you kept things away from pollutants like dust, they wouldn't rot. Whereas if you let dust settle on them, it would. If you let flies land on it, you'd get maggots and so forth. So he was able to use the microscope to show that, and he used that skill to save the French silk industry and wine industry when they had infections of the silkworms and also in the batches of wine. He found that the bad wine and bad beer that some vineyards and some breweries were experiencing was due to bacteria being there rather than the yeast that were present in the good batches. Now, they didn't have the terms at the time for yeast or bacteria. They were called entomolecules at the time. But he was able to designate that some were good and some were bad, and he actually came up with a way to kill off these bad viruses before that got into the food supply. And what do you think that process is called? Pasteurization. There we go. So basically, if you pasteurize something, you raise the level of heat to the point where it kills off the bacteria without fully denaturing the proteins of the food involved. We'll come back to Virchow when we talk about treatments as well, because he did a lot, not Virchow, pardon me, to Pasteur when we talk about treatments. But in terms of concepts of disease, the fact that he was able to tie purulent activity to bacteria was not lost on a lot of people. One of the people who really ran with it was another German, Robert Koch, and he came up with the designation that anthrax was a bacterial disease and laid down the rules that basically stipulate how you can tell when something is responsible for that disease. That you always find that microorganism present in the disease, that you can isolate it and then infect other animals or others with it thereafter, harvest it from them, reinfect, and that you don't find that disease in the absence of that microorganism. So he was able to isolate and come up with the bacterial causes for many, many diseases. And it was able to also then follow that up with vaccinations when that became something that was able to be done. Now we're going to jump one more time to another topic entirely, but we'll come back to vaccination next time when we talk about treatment and how budding microbiology was able to actually lead us to the point where we could do something about it rather than just describing what caused the disease. Now when it comes to mental activity, the mind has always been a bit of a puzzle. And essentially, one of the earliest methods that people would use to try to understand how the mind worked was called phrenology. Now, phrenology was come up with by a guy named Franz Joseph Gall. And essentially, the idea was that you had various mental organs in your brain. That's what he called them, mental organs. And that those organs would be hyper-developed in some, less developed in others, and that they would leave an imprint on the skull. So these phrenologists would go around palpating people's skulls and try to say, oh, you have a very advanced creative side. Oh, you've got this other side that's not so good. And basically try to convince themselves that they could tell what someone's mental aptitudes were just by feeling their skull. Now, point of fact, the brain does not leave imprints on the skull that would allow you to do that, nor were the places that the phrenologists put these various mental organs anywhere located where we contemporarily think of, or where we think of those being located now in terms of different functions. It took a while, but essentially phrenology was eventually discredited because people realized it didn't really mean anything. And it was really just there to reinforce the idea that, oh, well, people of certain races have highly developed skulls in this area, so obviously that makes them awesome, and these people from other races have skulls that are less developed in other areas, and that's what makes them inferior to us, white Europeans and so forth. So it really was just there to underscore the existing power structure, and thankfully people got rid of it. The problem was they overreacted. Phrenology had been so badly discredited that the new paradigm was that the brain was very diffuse, and the brain was a network, and you could not isolate mental activity in one place or another. So this is called more of a globalist paradigm for how the brain worked. Now the globalist paradigm really took its first shot when we had a really horrible accident happen to a guy named Phineas Gage. And the reason is that the phrenologists weren't totally wrong. Your brain does not have mental organs where they thought it was going to be, and it doesn't leave an imprint on the skull. But there is isolation of function in different parts of the brain. And that's what was demonstrated in 1848 when Phineas Gage had a massive head injury. So in the back, if you guys look to the back, would you mind holding that up? So here's our prop for today. Feel free to check it out. Can you hold it over your head Star Wars style? Like that? Okay, there we go. Thank you. I appreciate that. So basically, Phineas Gage was a railway foreman, and they were building a new railway, and so they were blasting out some rock to lay the new track. So one person would drill a hole, the next person in line would put gunpowder in that hole. Next person would put some cotton in there, and then the next person, who was Phineas Gage, had a rod like that, and he would tamp it down. Well, at some point, the guy in front of him forgot to fill one hole with cotton. The tamping rod went down, sparked, and that metal bar shot through Phineas Gage's left frontal lobe out the top of his head, landing like 30, 40 yards away. So he suffered this massive head injury and somehow not only survived it, he survived he didn't get an infection that killed him thereafter. He actually recovered from that. But because he lost that part of his brain, he didn't suffer global deficits in some things. He suffered personality deficits. He became very impulsive, wasn't able to control his activities. He used to be a very respectable, kind of even-keeled person. He became a little more prone to bursts of anger. He actually did recover over time. He actually was able to hold work as a stagecoach driver thereafter for several years. But he definitely had real losses caused by that specific area of damage. So if you guys want to go check that out, feel free, and just imagine that rocketing through someone's head and then them surviving it. And yeah, that's what people would use. It's really, you'd call it heavy, right? Yeah, so that went through a guy's head, went 30 feet in the air, or 30 yards in the air, came down far away. And yes, I did get a garden tool at Lowe's and angle grind it until it looked like that. So there we go. And I got to say I did that on work time because it's work related. So now that localization of function, it's good to enjoy your job. Now that localization of function had been more or less established, it became very well known through the work of Paul Broca and Wernicke. And I think some of you guys have probably heard those names. Broca was a neuropsychiatrist, basically, who was caring for people who'd suffered cerebral injury. They'd had strokes, they'd had other head injuries, and it caused them to be unable to function normally. And on autopsy, he was able to look at where the damage in their brain was. And amongst other things, he described an area that would cause Broca's aphasia. Now, does anybody want to shout out what kind of aphasia Broca's aphasia is? I heard very diffuse whispering, but I'm going to say expressive. Yes, expressive aphasia. So people with a lesion in this area of the lower frontal lobes were unable to create language. They couldn't speak anymore. But that was their only real problem. They could still understand language, they could still do all kinds of other things, but this one injury to the predominantly to the left side of their frontal lobe would cause a loss of language and nothing else. Likewise, Carl Wernicke, another colleague of his, found an area nearby where that would cause the opposite. You'd have what was called a receptive aphasia. You could still speak, you could still communicate, but you couldn't understand the language that was coming at you. So we're seeing that there are actually areas of the brain responsible for specific things. So what actually makes up the brain? In the 19th and 20th centuries, histologists were trying to get to that, but the brain is really tough. Actually, it's really tough to study because it's so squishy. It doesn't have a great deal of substance. It's tough to stain. It's tough to actually get to work on slides because it's so fatty because of the myelin inside of it that a lot of the preparation washes material away. So Camillo Golgi figured out the first effective stain for brain tissue and involved silver, and he was able to demonstrate the neurons. But because of the globalist paradigm, he saw all of these neurons being a completely uninterrupted network. There were no discrete cells in there. He saw this as being one uninterrupted network. Now, a Spanish histologist, and Spanish science really had kind of languished. It really was not at the forefront of anything, but it has Ramon y Cajal to thank for that big spot that they get, is that he fine-tuned Golgi's staining methods and spent a lot of time just poring over slides, and he actually was able to draw the circuitry of various parts of the brain. So right here, we've got what's called a Purkinje cell, but this is in the cerebellum, and he was able to actually see that there were interruptions between cells. He could actually see that there were what we now call synapses. There were places where one neuron met another neuron, and they were not continuous. So he and Golgi kind of had a war of words with each other in journals over whether they were connected, whether they were disconnected, which made it very awkward when they both won the Nobel Prize in Science for that discovery in 1906. So you can just imagine standing next to somebody who you disagree with completely, but you don't want to make a scene because you're getting a Nobel Prize. So you can imagine that, right? I do. Every day, okay. But basically, he took this method, fine-tuned it, and showed that the brain did actually have discrete structures located within it, and there were even discrete cells within the brain. So, jumping to America, we haven't talked much about America because America as a younger country had not really established scientific or medical institutes that were capable of being a place where advancement could happen. But in Philadelphia, we were starting to get, in the post-Revolutionary War era, some pretty good hospitals, pretty good researchers, including a surgeon named Samuel Gross, who actually did the first course in pathology in the US. He turned out to be on the wrong side of a very important controversy about infection and where infection comes from and whether you can actually fight infection with antiseptics. But he was legitimately trying to improve medical teaching and training in the US. The problem was that we had the Civil War. And the Civil War, basically, in addition to all the people who died, you lose a huge chunk of that generation of people contributing to any field, let alone medicine. And you've got this huge economic disruption caused by the war. American medicine just took a massive downturn, and the US became known as a place where you didn't really trust the doctors. And in fact, physicians in the US who wanted to be really good had to go travel to Europe to train there to get the credentials to be respected in the US. So yeah, it wasn't a great time. Take a moment. So the big turnaround, at least the major one, happened when Johns Hopkins was founded. So Johns Hopkins was a railroad tycoon who had no heirs, so he donated a huge amount of his fortune to founding the Johns Hopkins School in Baltimore, as well as the Johns Hopkins Hospital and Medical School. Now, the school was going to be funded through his railroad stocks, but those stocks had lost a lot of their value between his death and the time they were actually going to start the school. So they were running short. They didn't have the money they needed, so they had to get creative. The wives and daughters of the people on the board of the school said, hey, we're very well connected. We are going to go across country and we will raise the funds for this school, this medical school, to open if you meet some of our demands. And their outrageous demands were this. It had to be postgraduate. You actually had to have a degree prior to coming to the school. Sound familiar? So that one stuck around. Students had to speak English, French, and German, be able to read those journal articles. Okay, you guys happy that that's not one of our prereqs anymore? Okay, good. It had to be associated with a teaching hospital. You actually had to be able to take the students to a clinical setting in their subsequent years to actually see how patients were treated. The medical faculty weren't allowed to be at the hospital and be at the school and have a completely outside practice that would distract them. They had to practice in the system in which they were teaching. And women were to be admitted on the same basis as men. Which one of these do you think was the problem? Yeah, so the board rejected it. They said, no, we're not doing that. That's ridiculous. But they were stuck. And eventually they said, okay, if you raise the money, we'll give in to your demands. And they did, and they did. So women were admitted to Johns Hopkins theoretically on the same basis as male students starting in 1893. So remember that, 1893, because women and minorities were accepted on an equal basis to men at the first osteopathic medical school, which opened in 1892. Hey, crazy. Okay, so if we had an osteopathic fight song, I would hope you'd all burst into, kind of like impassioned cheers, tears rolling down your cheeks at this moment here. But yeah, so osteopathy really did take, it doesn't get the same credit Johns Hopkins did for having that innovation, but it was there, and it was there ahead of Johns Hopkins. And I should also mention that the osteopathic medical school at that time was based around physiology, anatomy, and rejected pharmacology, largely because, and we'll talk about this next time, the pharmacology of the time was terrible. And it was acknowledged as such by many of the MDs at the time also. So honestly, if I could go back in time and I had to be a medical student, I'd probably prefer to go to A.T. Still School than to Johns Hopkins if it's in terms of being able to actually treat people thereafter with stuff that actually works in that context. Now, obviously, I'm biased, but Johns Hopkins gets the credit, and Johns Hopkins did a lot of good stuff. And one of the most important things they did was they wittingly or unwittingly hired these all-stars of medical education to be amongst the first faculty there. So a guy named William Welch studied histology and medicine in Europe, came back to Hopkins and became the head of the department there of medicine, and he is also a well-known pathologist. He'd actually discovered gas gangrene. It was actually named after him before it was changed to Clostridium perfringens, but it was originally Clostridium welchii. So he was a really well-known pathologist. He trained a lot of residents who went on to have exceptional careers, including some Nobel Prize winners, and he recruited several of the other people into the school. We'll talk more about them later, but OBGYN, surgery, anatomy, and medicine, he recruited the people who taught those courses, and they went on to become very influential people in their fields. Now, the reason Johns Hopkins gets a lot of the credit that they do for medical innovation is because in 1910, the Flexner Report was commissioned. Now, have you guys heard of this before? It's a big deal in medical education circles, but maybe not outside of that. The Flexner Report was bankrolled by the Carnegie Foundation and then thereafter the Rockefeller Foundation to look at medical education in America and see what worked and see what didn't. And so one guy, Abraham Flexner, went to various schools around the country and made recommendations, and his recommendations basically became the only thing that really works is the Hopkins model, and every school in America should adopt that model or be put out of business. And the Rockefeller Foundation put the money towards those schools who would adopt the Hopkins model, and other schools were forced to shut down. So what happened due to the Flexner Report? Well, medical education became more uniform, more quality controlled, and there was actually better quality of education because of the things the Hopkins model had. It was postgraduate, had to have a teaching hospital, and so forth. Oh, by the way, you'll not be surprised that women being accepted on an equal basis as men was quietly dropped from those recommendations. Laboratory training, followed by clinical training. People who were just scamming people. They were selling terrible medicines. They were just saying they were doctors with no training. It became much harder for them to cheat the public and basically scam people who had no way of knowing whether they were actually trained as a physician or not. Another thing that happened was the American Medical Association, very specifically those with MDs, became the dominant voice in medical education, and that's where the funding thereafter would go to. So they were able to attack competitors like osteopathic medical schools, midwife schools, and so forth. And MD schools decreased, by about half. DO schools didn't decrease by half, but there were much fewer of them to start with, and at least a couple of them had to close at that time and kind of work in to be able to work with the Hopkins model eventually. So the improved funding was available only to the MD schools, and the osteopathic schools had to kind of creep along without that infrastructure for laboratories or research. And in fact, they stayed ineligible for that federal funding until the 1960s. So the funding and the research associated with osteopathic schools was much later to come along and really took a lot longer to develop because of that funding imbalance. Now, jumping from the early 1900s to now, the major events that happened that took us from understanding of disease, moving from the whole body to organs, to tissues, to cells, to even smaller things, happened within 15 years. And it's really just kind of a remarkable span of achievements. So in 15 years, starting in 1940, so Beadle and Tatum showed that protein structure was connected to heredity, so genes. Genes were a concept that existed, but there was no mechanical or kind of material model for what genes actually were, but they were thought to be the units of heredity, and they were related to protein somehow. 44, Rockefeller Institute, Oswald Avery linked those genes to DNA. Not known how, but DNA, which up until that point it just thought to be cellular ballast, it was just kind of junk stuff in the cells, was suddenly thought to be, wow, this stuff could actually be important. It might actually have something to do with heredity. And then in 1953, using what we will charitably call borrowed X-ray diffusion data from Rosalind Franklin, James Watson and Francis Crick described the double helix of DNA and how they form base pairs. Just so you're aware of the controversy, Watson and Crick took the X-ray images off Franklin's desk and then excluded her from subsequent mention in their work, and she died of cancer shortly thereafter and wasn't really able to press her case as having made an important contribution to actually discovering that, even though the original data was from her, but the interpretation was done by Watson and Crick thereafter. But now we've got protein, genes, DNA connected, and in 1989, a team in Toronto, led by Lap-Chi Tsui, discovered that you could actually have a single gene result in a disease. We'd link genes to bacteria. We'd link genes to spread of bacteria through water and so forth. This is the first time a single gene was shown to be responsible for a disease. It was cystic fibrosis. And if you mutated a single gene in that chloride pump, you can wind up with a disease that causes mucus to build up in the lungs and block that area. So that was the first but not the last disease that genes were actually able to be dealt with and treated as the basis for that disease. And the roots of disease keep getting smaller and smaller. But one thing I think is kind of inadvertently hilarious is as we've moved from the general to the more and more specific, as we get into understanding of immunology, we start to wind up with more generalized causes of disease, because when you talk about immunology and you talk about immune, autoimmune, allergic reactions, it does affect multiple systems of the body. So it's like we're coming back to the same place we started, but with a much better foundation for what the mechanisms of disease are. And honestly, I think we're just going to keep on doing that cycle of general to specific to very specific to general and so forth. All right, so we're going to continue with that application. You guys can learn a lot about it, and that's probably going to be where a lot of the innovations in your lifetime are going to be happening at that very, very fine level. But the real exciting things will be when those fine little fiddly details can be manifest in a way that causes disease in an entire body and then can be dealt with in that way. All right, that is it for tonight. We've talked about disease. Next time we'll talk about what people actually tried to do about it. Thank you. And for the love of God, it took me forever to shave that thing down with an ankle grinder. Please, please go heft it up a little bit.